Okay, so today we're just going to walk through the basic principles of sentence structure in syntax, expanding on what we've already learned about phrase structure in the last lecture. So I'm basically, my goal is to just walk you through what a sentence looks like. It's a new type of phrase, although it looks in structure form basically like all the other phrases we've seen already. And then after showing you some examples, we're going to walk through the practice exercises together, the second set of practice exercises together in another video. So this one hopefully shouldn't take too long to get the basic idea down. But where I'm going to start out from is the phrase structure rules for noun phrases that I was talking about a little bit in the last lecture. So for a noun phrase can consist of a determiner followed by an n bar. Remember, we're calling this the specifier of the phrase, and that n bar can be broken down itself into a noun, which is the head of the noun phrase, and a prepositional phrase complement. And then this is the pattern I was alluding to last time, that the prepositional phrase itself can be broken down this way. It might have, say, a specifier of its own, like a degree word, like almost, and then that would be a sister node to a P bar. And the P bar would break down into a preposition, which heads the whole phrase, and then a noun phrase itself. So we've got a prepositional phrase inside a noun phrase, and then we can break down a prepositional phrase such that it has a noun phrase inside of it as well. So that gets interesting. This is the question: is where can this combination of rules take us? I kind of told you the answer last time to begin with. But what it gets us is infinite recursion, potentially. So we have a noun phrase that has a prepositional phrase inside of it, and that prepositional phrase has a noun phrase inside of it. That noun phrase itself can have a prepositional phrase inside of it, and that prepositional phrase can have a noun phrase inside of it, and we can just keep going like this as long as we want, according to the rules of syntax. We can embed as many different noun phrases within a noun phrase as we want. We can embed as many different prepositional phrases inside the noun phrases we want. We can get a phrase like the book from the library in the city near the airport beside the apartment complex with the playground of the children from the school behind the train tracks, so on and so forth, ad infinitum. There's no reason we ever have to stop according to the formal way these rules work. So that's pretty cool. And now we have a mechanism in place, or a formalism, I guess, that helps us represent how this can possibly work in the mind of a speaker. So we've gone from just talking about how maybe phrases might consist of individual strings of words to talking about this sort of hierarchical structure, which enables us to account for the fact that the grammar of language can generate patterns of patterns. So you can think about a phrase as a pattern of words, and phrases with phrases in them are patterns of patterns, basically. Okay, cool. We can also talk about other types of potentially infinitely long sentences. I wasn't actually able to present these sentences to you back in January because things were messed up in a different way back then. But remember, hopefully you remember that we talked about sentences like Jean knows that Charlie said that Sue suspects that Bill thinks that Beth hopes that Barry is a genius. There's quite a lot of embeddings going on here, and I played you some samples, or I think Darren probably played you samples.
Do they know that we know?
From this wacky episode of the TV show Friends, where I can't remember who finds out what, but they all pretend that they don't know what the other person knows, or they try to put it off in such a way that they can kind of keep the string of embeddings going. And so we've got sentences like this.
Do they know that we know?
Or this.
But see, they don't know that we know that they know.
Or this.
They don't know that we know they know we know.
So on and so forth. So you can think of scenarios in which these sorts of patterns would make sense, or these sort of sentences could be used. They don't have to actually have any obvious meaning in the real world, though. All that matters to syntax is that you can do the embeddings, that the rules of the grammar work out such that you can create these sentences, whether or not you could ever possibly think of a situation where they might be useful. Syntax is not always going to be useful, but it will be creative. It will enable you to say all sorts of infinitely long things that you may have never heard before in your life. And actually, I kind of hope that you have never heard anything in your life before that's infinitely long, because you'd probably still be hearing it. And no need to make any jokes about this lecture in that context. So, all right. So in order to understand how this works, we've kind of figured out how infinitely long noun phrases might work. What we want to get to is an understanding of how infinitely long sentences like this might work. But in order to do that, we need to know two things. One is how sentences work in the basic form that are not infinitely long. And then secondly, we need to know about verb complements, the different sorts of phrases that can be complements in a verb phrase. We'll find out verbs kind of form like the crux of a sentence, it turns out. We'll see that on the next slide. But we also need to know something about how verbs can take different phrases as complements, or specific verbs can take specific types of phrases as complements, and they're picky in that way. Okay, don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's focus on just the sentence structure aspect of this first. We'll deal with the verb complements in the next lecture after the practice exercises. Okay, so sentences. We've learned about basic phrase types, including noun phrase, verb phrase, adjective phrase, prepositional phrase. We're going to add one more phrase type to that, a basic sentence we're going to call a tense phrase. We're not just going to have a level that's like sentence. That level is going to be a tense phrase. What I mean by tense, tense is a property of the verbs. Like I said, the verb phrase is kind of forming the core of the sentence in a way, because a tense phrase will give you a description of at what time what tense is being described by the verb in that verb phrase. So you can think of tense as like past, future, present, so on and so forth. There's others we can think about as well. But where in time the action or the verb is happening. So that's the head of this tense phrase is going to be the tense of the verb, and we're going to describe this. I've got this written out in three different types of what look like features here, like we saw in phonology. We're primarily only going to specify the tense as such when we're dealing with past or not past things. When we deal with the future tense in English, we can that becomes explicit in English. We use the word will. So we're not actually going to use future or present as specific tenses. We'll just use this one, but just so you know, that's what I mean by tense. So the head of the tense phrase is the tense of the verb. The specifier of the tense phrase is the subject noun phrase. I'll say a few more things about that. And then, the complement of the tense head is a verb phrase. And then within that verb phrase, if you have a complement of the verb phrase being a noun phrase, it's called the object of a verb. So you may have heard these terms before. If you haven't, I'll walk you through them. But you, in a sentence, often have a subject followed by a verb followed by an object. And we'll see that how their structures kind of fit into this general pattern. I said this before, but verbs have lots of different complement options. And I'm going to show you how this basic structure works with the sentence, the coach dropped the ball. And just as we go into it, in case you haven't heard this terminology before, our main verb here is dropped, the subject is the coach, and the object is the ball. So how does this work? We've got a sentence that looks like this. So the whole thing is called a tense phrase. This is headed by this plus past tense. So this is not an explicit word here. It's just that feature of the verb plus past as opposed to minus past. The complement of that head tense is the verb phrase, which itself is headed by the verb dropped. So kind of what's crucial here is that these two things have to agree with each other. So if I have a plus past tense in this slot, this verb has to be in the past tense. So we see this with this inflectional affix ed. It's dropped, something that happened in the past, right? So I'm going to highlight those and then point out the other aspects of this, which is two other noun phrases. So we have a noun phrase here in the specifier slot of this highest level TP. So this noun phrase, as I mentioned before, is the subject of the sentence. I'll go back to that previous slide here in a second. This is our subject, this noun phrase specifier, and our object is going to be this thing here, which is in the complement slot of this VP. So the coach dropped the ball or will drop the ball. To go back to that other slide that I skipped, If I have an auxiliary verb, it will appear in this T slot. It will replace that plus past marker for the tense, and we will know explicitly that this is in the future because will. In English, it just so happens we don't explicitly mark the verb for future. Some other languages do. In English, we just have will basically bear the tense or show the tense for the verb, and we make it an explicit verb on the surface of the sentence that we don't see if it's a past or present tense verb. Okay, so just to walk through again, this is what it looks like for the coach dropped the ball. Those two tenses have to agree. And this is what it looks like when we have an explicit auxiliary showing up in that tense slot for the TP phrase. And then this is our subject, and this is our object. Okay, so hopefully the basics of that make sense. I'll just say a few more things about cases in English. So we see this in English effectively only in the pronouns of English. So other languages, and I'll show you an example in a second, other languages not only mark different tenses for the verbs, but they also mark different cases for nouns and pronouns. So in English, the way this works is that the form of the pronoun will change depending on whether the pronoun is a subject or an object. This is one case where English is relatively simple, but it hasn't lost the case marking completely, so we still kind of get a sense of how it works. So I can have a sentence like I know you, or you can flip it around and say you know me. So I is called the first person pronoun because I is the speaker, that's the first person you consider in a conversation. You is the second person pronoun because that's the person you're talking to. So in this case, I is the subject, you is the object. You flip it around, you stays the same. That's always the same in English. But me changes. So this is the first person pronoun in the subjective case, and this is the first person pronoun in the objective case, I or me. He is one of the third person pronouns, so it's singular, male. I think that's probably my parents calling, so I'm going to have to edit this and get back to you.